we can start with our next speaker. That's Casey Watts. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. When I saw your proposal for the talk, I was like, oh my God, this is beautiful. This is going to be awesome. So for those who don't know Casey yet, you should. But if you don't know, he's the author of Debugging Your Brain. This is what he's going to talk about today with us. And it's going to be just awesome. Casey is exactly what I was talking about, like this intersection between humans and technology. So he has a background as a neurobiologist. He studied psychology, and he is also working in software development since like 10 years for including one of the places he has worked in at is Heroku. So he has a long history of both, of knowing both topics very, very well. Casey can play 10 instruments. I would like to understand, how do you manage to also learn 10 instruments? That's amazing. But the most amazing thing I'm reading here, he owns one in every color of the rainbow. That's so awesome. I'll leave the stage to you. Thank you so much for joining us again, and see you in a bit. Enjoy.
Thanks, Monica. Hi, I'm Casey. Thanks for coming to this talk. I'm going to tell you about myself, but first I want to mention this is being recorded. You'll have access to the recording later if you want to go back to anything, so you don't have to worry about taking notes. I also sent a resources document, a Google Doc, in the chat, in the stage chat, if you want to grab that. And feel free to take notes if you want to, but you don't need to. I'm trying to make it easy for you. Welcome to Debugging Your Brain. I'm going to give you an overview of all the content in my book, as much as I can cram into this slot. First, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I like to blow bubbles. I live in Washington, D.C., where when we're not in a quarantine, I like to take my crates of bubble equipment to the park and have people have fun. I do have instruments in every color. Here you can see a bunch of them at the top. I also love to partner dance, like swing and blues. I used to be a teacher. Here's me teaching some classes. You might notice some teacherisms in the way I present. I have worked in tech for 10 years, most recently at USCIS and Heroku as a product manager and engineering manager. Lately, I'm doing freelance work, consulting. I want to help companies be very happy and effective by using the psychology techniques for inclusive teams and improved team health. I do a bunch of employee training and coaching, kind of like the content in this talk today. A long time ago, the research I did at Yale that I helped with was about memory in rats. And you can see this nice sentence here, which I could explain, but it's not the topic of this talk today. So we'll skip past that. All right, what is this talk going to look like? I'm going to cover what to debug at first, and then we'll do an activity where you can think of how you'll apply this to your own life. And then we'll go through a whole bunch of techniques how to debug these trouble situations in your brain. All right, so what to debug? You probably recognize this feeling when you have negative thoughts that lead you to negative feelings, that lead you to more negative thoughts, and you feel worse and worse and worse. We call this a downward spiral of negative emotion. And that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. This is a buggy functioning of the brain. Usually it's counterproductive, not that helpful. You want to stop it if you can. Another term is rumination, where you're in a bad situation and you're just going in circles, thinking about it over and over and over, focusing on the negative parts, the causes and consequences, instead of the solutions and trying to be productive about it. It's hard to do. It's easy to get stuck in ruminating. We'll go through some examples of rumination and downward spirals from my life. One is having an argument at work. Imagine you know a way to solve a problem and your coworker knows a different way and you don't agree, and maybe you disagree loudly, and then you might feel bad about disagreeing loudly at work and then wonder, am I a good coworker? Am I being too pushy? Wait, maybe I should be more pushy, and like it might feel worse and worse. Once my mom snapped at my brother for leaving the door open, and that's a story I'll come back to later in the talk. If you're a parent, I'm sure you can relate to this. Like sometimes kids just get on your nerves. They can be hard to deal with. And then you might wonder, am I a good parent? Am I parenting well? Am I helping my kid or hurting them? And you might downward spiral from that. A third example is when I was headed to a meetup event and I was hungry and angry. I was wet and running late and I stepped in a puddle and I thought lots of nasty thoughts to myself until I caught it, recovered, and then made it to the meetup. And we'll go into that story a little more later too. So I'm gonna have this, I'm posting in the chat. Um, here is an activity. I'll set a timer. I want you to come up with some challenging experiences from the past month when you had or almost had a downward spiral, and then share them in the stage chat sidebar. You'll see I posted the same content from this slide in the sidebar. And this will help frame the rest of the talk for you. So it's important that you get some good examples for it. I'll set a timer. And set. If you have any questions, I also have this stage chat sidebar open. I'm happy to answer questions there. I see some people sharing in the chat already. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. All right, that's been 3 minutes. If you have something in progress, feel free to share that in the sidebar chat when you're done. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving forward. Yeah, thank you for sharing, everyone who has. I want to point out that these challenging experiences are real, and nothing that we cover today will help the stress completely go away. But we will help stop you from having a downward spiral and ruminating and spinning out of control on some of these. That's the goal, is to make it better, not to completely fix things. That's not possible necessarily. You probably saw the link earlier already, the resources. The resources link, if you go through the links, points to these 3 resources I want to call out. On the left here are high-level concepts. That's like all the lists that we're going to go through in the talk today. The middle is a worksheet for a single challenging experience, like the ones you just came up with. You can go through for a given one and try the different techniques. And then a third one is one-time activities, like additional reading you could do. All right, my big question is, how can we help people deal with these challenging experiences more effectively? What things can we do? There are a bunch. One of the best ones, if you can, is therapy, where you get a personal trainer for your brain. There's a lot of stigma around therapy, though. There's barriers, including stigma, financial barriers if your health insurance doesn't cover it. And then even if you do get it covered and you find someone, they may or may not be a good match. You might need to shop around to find a good therapist who's compatible for you. And it can be hard. Not everyone gets therapy. I also want to call out the stigma to therapy. A lot of people believe you have to have a diagnosed mental illness in order to go to therapy. And that's not true. A lot of people go to therapy without a mental illness, without a diagnosis of a problem, formal kind of problem. You can go and just talk about your life and the stress, and they can help you come up with techniques to cope with it. A lot of them we'll cover in this talk at a high level, but this is like a one-on-one personal trainer situation. Another way you can learn these skills is learning on your own, like self-help books or podcasts or videos. If it helps you, that's great, whatever they are. And like a lot of people end up learning these skills through self-help. Not everybody goes to therapy. It's not the only way to do it. It's just the most powerful, like a personal trainer. One of the books I recommend to people is Feeling Good. That's the name of the book, by David Burns. That's the one that popularized CBT to the masses with people, and you didn't have to go to therapy to learn these big ideas. I wrote my book Debugging Your Brain because I wanted to have a much shorter version, concise overview of all the big ideas, and then frame it in very structured, explicit, discrete ways that developers like. And I'm proud this book is so short. It's 90 pages, and it's an hour-and-a-half audiobook. And it's like the same content as we're covering today, just more. I'm also working on a board game version of the book. This is a lot of fun. So I love in workshops when you do breakouts and you can talk to each other, because that's often where you learn the most. You reflect on yourself, you share yourself. And the board game version is exactly that. You talk about your problems with your friends in a structured way. If you're interested in beta testing this board game, I would love to talk to you later. Reach out. The talk is structured in a way similar to the board of the board game. We're going to go from left to right through each of these sections. All right, another way, other than individual learning or therapy, is community. You need community to be a healthy human being. Nobody can live alone. And it takes a lot of people to support anyone. There's plenty of research showing that people with stronger social ties and connections have stronger, better mental health outcomes and life outcomes, happiness. We need community. All right, what inspired Debugging Your Brain, the book and the board game? There's 2 therapies I want to call out: cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is the most common talk therapy. It's used to treat so many mental illnesses, like almost all of them. It seems like there are very few that it doesn't help with at all. For example, for treating depression, it can be as effective as antidepressant drugs. This talk therapy approach is just very powerful. I like to call it cognitive behavioral training because the therapy part has the stigma attached, and really this is useful for everyone. Everyone can benefit from the ideas in this. It's my big idea. The second therapy that I get ideas from is dialectical behavioral therapy, And from that, I really pull in this 6 levels of validation idea, which we'll cover in the talk. And this is the idea that you want to be understood by other people for your mental health and well-being. And that's my favorite part, honestly, is going through validation with people because it's the most eye-opening, the mind-blowing part. In this talk, we're going to go through these 5 sections. In developer terms, it's kind of like when you're debugging a bug and you hit a debugger breakpoint in introspection. In identifying inputs, it's like you're seeing what's going on, reading the code, trying to figure that out. Processing experiences is when you're trying to understand the code and describe it to someone else very clearly. Validation is like writing unit tests to make sure that you've got it right and any changes you make will still be true. And then cognitive restructuring is like editing the code and changing it so that it runs better. You fix the bug or it's easier to read later. But we'll go through these in terms of the brain more than programming, starting with introspection. Oh yeah, and they map to the board. Same. We'll start with system modeling the brain. So here's the simplest model of a system, input, process, output model. You might recognize this because it looks like a function. Functions have arguments and they have a return value and there's code in the middle. And then something happens in the app that calls the function again later, maybe. This IPO model we can apply to the brain. In classic psychology experiments, like the one Pavlov's dog experiment, he trained the dog to associate the ring of a bell with food coming, and the dog would salivate when anticipating the food. And then he would measure the milliliters of saliva the dog produced as the variable that he was measuring. And the dog would still salivate when the bell rang, even if there was no food present, because the dog associated it. And this was interesting because he was measuring like input, output in a very measurable, scientific kind of way. We like to think humans, though, have this part in the middle, so we're not input-output machines. No, we think we're always in charge of what's going on, but that's not quite true. Often we're on autopilot and our habits are running things, and we kind of are input-output machines in those moments. But when we need to, we can switch to a manual, mindful mode, and then we're more in control. It just takes more energy and effort and time when we do that. So we're not always able to do manual, but sometimes it's useful to switch gears. To switch gears, I'm going to share this technique, the whoop technique. I developed this with my mom in that scenario where she was yelling at my brother for not closing the front door. So here's how that scenario went. She was upset. She was like, "Why wouldn't you close the door?" And then we all went, "Whoop!" We made that loud sound, and we talked to her. She knew this was coming. She wanted to work on when to become introspective and think about it, and this was one of those moments. So she was upset about the door. We whooped, and then she said, "Yes, yes, very good. You're right. I should take a moment and think." And she thought, and she thought, and she realized she hadn't eaten yet. She didn't eat that day because as a busy mom, she didn't have time to do it. No wonder she was upset at such a small thing. She's glad she caught it. And especially the first few months we had this technique, we were just whoop, 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 whoop all the time, left and right. We still do it sometimes, but it's a great way to surprise yourself, to get yourself to switch to the manual mode. It's like hitting a debugger breakpoint. You hit it, and then all of a sudden the program stops and you're working on debugging. Maybe you hit continue if you don't have time right now, but you have the opportunity to fix it. If you can hit this whoop state, if you can become mindful on command, that's awesome. I want you to celebrate it, even if you don't know what to do next. Even if you get there and you're just confused or not sure what to do. All right, we'll try this activity together. I'll count down from 3, and I want you to whoop at home. 3, 2, 1, whoop! This is so funny. Sometimes I whoop myself when I'm alone. I'll just do it out loud. Or in my head. If I do it in my head loudly enough, that gets me to shift gears too. Or any other prompt that gets you to shift gears is going to have the same effect. It doesn't have to be the word whoop. This is just the memorable one that I did with my mom that you might remember. We're not doing all the activities. Next up is identifying inputs. With this one, we'll start with the inner versus outer brain. So here's a cat gif. This poor cat turns around, sees a cucumber, and jumps out of the way in fear, thinking it might be a threat. And then I like to imagine the cat turns around and investigates and realizes it's just a cucumber. It's not a true threat. You can illustrate this in the brain by thinking about the inner versus outer brain. In the inner brain, the limbic system, things are a lot faster. They happen on the scale of milliseconds. But in the outer brain cortex, they go through a longer path. You can see in the image there, and it takes seconds. Thinking is slower than feeling often. Right. With that set, now we're going to talk about the 4 inputs. So I broke down for this input process output model in your mind what things are inputs and what things you're in control of. So the left 4 are not under your control. All we can do is accept that they happen to us and move on from there. And stressing about them and like, I shouldn't have felt that is counterproductive because they happen to you. You didn't choose it. It's not under your control. But these 2 are under your control. These are the levers you can use to modify the system. We'll go through these. 2 of them are thoughts and feelings, in particular, automatic thoughts and automatic feelings. When these happen to you, you didn't choose them. You can't fully be responsible for them, and it's best to try to not stress over them, treat them as inputs. If you have a deliberate thought when you choose to think something, that is under your control, and you can feel proud if you are using those to steer yourself in the right direction. You can also influence your feelings using those deliberate thoughts, and I consider that under your control, partially at least. There are 2 other inputs. Can you imagine what they are? Thoughts and feelings sometimes feel like they're everything. The third one is external stimuli, so stuff that happens to you. That's certainly an input. If you stub your toe on a couch, or if you have an argument with a coworker, that argument happened to you, and that counts as an input, that situation you're in. And then the fourth one, a lot of people don't think of right away, like my mom didn't either, and that's bodily state, like hangry. So if you didn't sleep enough, if you're over caffeinated, if you haven't eaten enough, or if you're sick, all those things affect your mood and your responses so much, and that's not fully under your control either. Those happen to you. So when you're considering what's going on and you're in a stressful situation, it's good to search through these 4 different types of inputs so you don't miss a big one. Here is another way of drawing that same idea. Automatic thoughts and feelings happen to you. Your bodily state is also in you, and external stimuli is the stuff outside of you that happens. One way to get much better at identifying these inputs is mindfulness meditation. I'm not going to go into it here, but there's a lot of ways you can work on this on your own. My doctor prescribed it to me like 5 years ago, and it's very powerful. It's like well studied. Sometimes it can sound a little spiritual, and some people don't like that. But mindfulness meditation is like scientifically measured to be very effective at getting you to be comfortable with your automatic thoughts and feelings. Powerful. Right, we're not doing that activity. By the way, if you want to do mindfulness meditation, you could try. There are a lot of YouTube videos that are good and popular. I also like the apps Calm and Headspace, and those are linked to in the notes also. All right, so we did the whoop. You identified the 4 inputs. The next section is about processing experiences. We're going to go through a bunch of techniques. We'll start with thinking, which is the least powerful, and then go through the rest of these on the right, one at a time. So thinking, a lot of problems we do by thinking. We don't pull out the other techniques, and it can help often, but it has this risk that you will have a downward spiral or ruminate more. It's less resistant to these than the other techniques because it's easier to spiral when you're just thinking in circles. So if you're ever in this stressful situation, one of these, then I suggest you can think about using one of the other techniques and not just thinking. My favorite technique of the ones we're about to cover is talking to a friend. It's really powerful, and there are layers in which it's really powerful that I'll go through. One layer, the lowest one, is if you talk at a friend. If you're just saying the words out loud, then they can like form in the world and they exist and you've said them and you've like nailed down the words, and that's helpful. Even just that, even if they're not listening, just saying the words out loud is helpful. If your friend is actively listening and they can reflect back to you like, yes, that makes sense, um, or like, it sounds like you're upset, just like reflecting back, that can be more helpful too. And then another level, you can ask them to actively help you think about like why it happened and what to do next, and ask them for help beyond just listening. You can use this technique to imagine a friend's response, even if you don't have the friend with you. I'm often surprised how well this works. I'm like, what would Pablo say? And then I can use my mental model of him to come up with what he would say. Sometimes I do this by writing a text message or a Slack message to a friend or a coworker and explain the problem. And just by writing it out to them in terms I think they would understand, I can get to the root of the problem myself and I don't have to send it. It's really powerful. All right, that's talking to a friend. You can also talk to a duck or a cat or a plant or anything that won't talk back. And that can have this first effect where you're just saying the words out loud. And that's helpful too, getting the words articulated. And you can imagine what they would respond with if you can think they have context or whatever questions they would have. I'm curious in the chat if you want, what what do you talk to at home? What creature or plant or anything like that? All right, writing is my third technique here, alternative to thinking. And with this, you have some similar benefits. You're writing it down on paper, so you're getting the words out into the world. You can also reread it very accurately because you wrote the words down and it's going to perfectly reflect what you wrote. And another benefit here is you can edit it. So if you don't like the way one thing sounds when you reread it, you can edit it right there in the document that you're editing or on paper, cross it out. Writing's great too. All right, my fourth option here is reading. When you're reading, you're not necessarily getting your thoughts out, but you might find something relevant. Like if you're reading fiction and someone is in a similar situation, then you might get some insight from that. Or if you're reading nonfiction, something like Ask a Manager, you could get someone's insight who you don't normally work with in a similar situation that you're in. And that can be really helpful too. No, not that one. All right, next activity is expanding your emotional vocabulary. So a lot of people only use a few words to describe emotions, like the headers of this chart, the basic ones. These are also the ones in Pixar's Inside Out, which is a great movie that illustrates this pretty well. But we all understand more words than we use. And if you can become more skilled at wielding this vocabulary, it can help you articulate it and be understood by others and understand yourself. There's a bunch of different resources I recommend to expand your emotional vocabulary. There's this chart is nice. I like this circle one. It has nice colors and shows relationships between them. My favorite one though is this taxonomy. A researcher did card sorting with people to see which words feel most related to others and then group them together. So sometimes I'll go to this and say, all right, I'm angry. Sure, that's the big five, the one that I am. And I'll go in, I'm not enraged, I'm not disgusted, maybe I'm irritable. And then bringing into irritable, I'll say, okay, grumpy. Grumpy is a good word for this. I like to use this chart a lot. It's better than a thesaurus for me. And that Wikipedia page that links to all those is linked in the resources a couple times. All right, that's processing experiences. Our next section is validation. The term validation in programming is different than the one here, but it has some similarities too. In talking to people, validation means accepting another person's experience as understandable, whether or not you agree. This is the big thing, is you don't have to agree with someone to validate them, to say, that makes sense. I understand how you would think that. Who can help who with validating and feeling understood? There's a couple of directions you can use this. We're going to go through you supporting a friend in our examples, but you can use this to validate other people like that, or you can ask other people to validate you. You can also use these to validate yourself. All right, we'll go through these levels. I take this idea, the 6 levels of validation from DBT, and I broke it up into these 2 sections so we can go through them, and maybe it's a little more memorable. The first section is listening, like we were just doing with talking to a friend. And the second one is validating, saying it makes sense in different levels. We'll go through the listening section first. So when you're listening to a friend, your friend is there on the right. They're trying to debug their brain, and you're listening. You're the one on the left. First of all, if you're just present, physically present, or available on chat or video call or phone call, and if they just know you're there for them, that's helpful. You don't even have to say any words. And sometimes they're not ready to share their experience. They're just so stressed, but they want company. They want to be around someone in case they're ready or for the support. And you don't have to say anything, and you can still be supportive. Sometimes your friend is ready to share, and you can just listen. Again, you don't have to say anything, but this time they're sharing their experience with you, and that can be really helpful. Sometimes they want to talk at you. They just want to say their words out into the air. They don't even need you to like actively listen and say, "Oh, that's so sad." That might distract. You might distract them if that's the mode they're in. Sometimes they want accurate reflection, like active listening. So then you can say, "It sounds like you're upset. That would be very frustrating," and like active listening, things like that. I want to call a big distinction here. In practice, these can overlap some, but accurate reflection is about saying back to them only what they said to you and not filling in any gaps. And the next level is careful guessing, where you are filling in the gaps. And if you fill in the gaps accurately and you guess correctly, you say, "Oh, that's so unfair. That's terrible." Then you can make them feel very validated because they feel so understood. They did not even have to say it for you to understand them. But there's a risk with guessing, because if you guess wrong, that can be invalidating. It can be really counterproductive. It can make them question their sense of the world if you guessed wrong strongly and they couldn't correct you about it. You don't want to invalidate your friends. If you are at risk of that, it may be better just to accurately reflect instead of guessing wrong. But if you leave room for correction, you can use this technique and get the benefits of guessing correctly without the big risk of guessing wrong. And I have 2 techniques under this one to help you guess with room for correction. The 2 techniques are kind of similar. There's the open-closed spectrum is the first one. So an open-ended question, you're not suggesting the feeling at all or the experience, saying, "What did that feel like?" Very open. And the most closed end of the spectrum, you might be saying something like, "That is so unfair," like as a statement, as fact. And it's harder for them to correct you. If they didn't think it was unfair, if they thought it was pretty fair, they'd have to say, "No, it was fair." And not everyone's comfortable doing that in every situation and every relationship. So it's good for you to think about where on the spectrum you want to be for the conversation you're in. I tend to like the ones in the middle of the spectrum, where I am saying that it's unfair, but I'm leaving room for correction by asking it as a question. Did it feel unfair? I'm not telling you that it felt unfair to you, but asking. And people are much more comfortable correcting that than the closed one. This spectrum is pretty similar. Here I'm stating my confidence level using my confidence words like imagine, guess, or must have. And if I'm saying things with lower confidence, that can be easier for people to correct also. Right, so for listening, those were the 4 levels. Just sitting there, no one's talking, just listening. You don't have to say anything to your friend. And then C and D there, accurate reflection is only saying back what they say to you, or you can guess, but only if you do it carefully because you don't want to invalidate anyone. All right, once you're on the same page, you're listening, you understand their experience, they feel like you understand their experience, you can go even further and validate them and say it makes sense. The lowest level here, the least powerful, is it makes sense for you based on your past. So the example I think of is I had a friend who was afraid of dogs. He wouldn't pet my dogs that I grew up with. But it made sense once I realized he was attacked by a dog when he was younger. So of course he wouldn't want to go near dogs anymore. So that is validating. Surprising to me, that's the lowest level. I could do better than that sometimes. I'll come back to the diagrams. If he was walking down the street to visit me and walked past a yard with a dog that was growling and snarling, I could say, oh, it makes sense you're afraid of the dog because of your experience as a kid. And that could be helpful some amount. But I could also say anyone would be afraid of that snarling dog, of course. And that's even more validating because it's not just their experience, it's like anyone. And then the higher level than that is if I was walking down the street or I knew the dog myself and I was afraid of the dog, I could say I am also afraid of the dog when it's snarling at me and I'm walking by. And that's even more powerful than just saying someone would, a person would. It's including myself in that. So for the diagram here, you is the weakest one, anyone is stronger. And if I include myself, if I have experienced that experience myself, then that's the strongest validation. All right, those are the validation levels. To apply these to people, sometimes I like to look up this reference before or after a conversation and think about which ones did I do, which ones do I want to practice on. It's a great framework, and when I learned it, I kept going back to it over and over until I really put it into practice. And I suggest you do the same if you're interested in validating people this way. Yeah, here's how it maps to the original, 6 levels of validation. But we don't need to go into that. All right, the other way around. If you want to ask for support using some of these levels, the one that you think you want, here are some examples. For each of the levels, you could say, could you sit with me quietly? Could you let me talk at you? You could ask someone, the one in C here I do at work a lot too. I say, hey, coworker, I want to make sure I'm making sense. Could you say back to me what I was just saying? And if they do accurately, then I'm sure. But if they miss some details, I'm glad I asked them to say it back. And then the fourth one here, you can ask, could you help me try to say it? Could you help me put this into words? Because I don't have all the words to describe it, and I'm working on it, and I'd like your help. Yeah, so those are just some examples that I say for those levels. And then for validation, usually I just ask open-ended, like, does it make sense? I'm sure you've said that before in your life too. Most people have. Like, how does it make sense? Does it make sense for me or for anyone? Or has it happened to you before, I might ask. Right, and all of those are listed under the resources too, of course. All right, last section, cognitive restructuring. So these are cognitive distortions. These are the 10 most common ones. These are thought patterns that use our like heuristics, mental shortcuts, and biases in the brain that can sometimes distort reality and make us feel worse. To illustrate, I'll go through some examples. When I was going to the meetup, hangry, wet, and late, here are some of my automatic thoughts that were bad. I said to myself, wet shoes are the worst. And then I went, whoop, thought about it. That, all right, that thought is suspicious. What's going on in there? I identified that I was magnifying the problem. I was blowing it out of proportion. They're not the worst. And my literal mind knows that. But identifying it as a distortion helped me realize and counter it. Another thought I had was, if I'm late, I should not even go. I went, whoop, and then identified that as cognitive distortion, all or nothing thinking. It's like black and white thinking. It is okay to do the middle option. A lot of people do that. I also thought today sucks. That's a big one. There's a lot in here. I was overgeneralizing the entire day. I was disqualifying all the positive stuff that happened earlier, and I was fortune telling that the rest of the day would also be bad because of my momentary state of being wet and hungry and tired. So those three thoughts on the left that we just covered, I countered them by saying some things like, I am feeling frustrated, which wasn't very satisfying to say, but it helped me stop spiraling as badly. I told myself it's okay to go late. People do it all the time. And I said, today can get better. Trying to brighten it. And then I ended up going, and I was happy I went. I'm happy I didn't let that momentary state of negative, it's like spiraling, stop me from attending the meetup. I recovered. This I recommend printing. It's linked to in the notes too. Whew, we've covered a lot of content. I'll go through some summary slides and then we'll have questions. I link to the resources a lot. This is what the website page looks like for those three that I keep listing, these three. That's what that looks like. If you want to get updates, sometimes I make new articles or resources, graphics, and videos. Sometimes I do more free workshops. Like I have a 2-hour version of this workshop. And for the validation section, I have a 1-hour workshop that I do where you like practice it with buddies. So if you're interested, feel free to get updates for that. We covered these 5 techniques, these 5 sections. You learned about the whoop technique to help you switch gears into a mindful state. We covered the input process output model and the 4 inputs that you should strive not to judge when they happen to you. And meditation can help with that, mindfulness meditation. We covered some techniques for processing experiences. Thinking is the least powerful often, but you can talk to a friend or a duck or plant or write things or read. For this, I find it helpful to have this list handy. So when I'm ruminating and I'm just thinking all the time, sometimes I can't remember that those 4 options are options. So if I reference something and I'll say, oh, right, of course, I should try writing. And then just like the prompt of the reference can help me switch gears. We covered the validation levels, so how you can support a friend in working through their feelings, or ask for support using these same levels, or validate yourself. You can apply these to yourself too. Same as the others, like having this as a reference when I need it is how I start learning it. Another one is the 10 most common maladaptive thought patterns. We didn't go through them all, I just gave you a few examples. There's a lot of writing on this, including Feeling Good by David Burns is a great intro to these with a ton of stories illustrating each one. There are a bunch of other tools. You could, of course, get a therapist. Try the book Feeling Good. For meditation, the apps Calm or Headspace I recommend. And then if social anxiety you think might apply to you some amount, you could use Joyable, and they have a screening for it. And that does CBT style prompts and check-ins for people with social anxiety. I haven't found an app yet for general CBT for people, and I'd love to see one. If you know of any, please let me know. Of course, I have a book, 90 pages or an hour and a half, that covers all these concepts. And I hear from people that they reference the book a lot. Like when they're going through a problem, they just go to the section with the part that they need, or even the table of contents. It's kind of similar to the handout on the website. If you're interested in more content like this, I do a workshop for companies. If you want to bring me to your company or community group, I do a team health and psychological safety workshop, kind of like the validation section, but I pull in other research. Prioritization, as a product manager, that was a big deal to me, and I found some ways to make it a really inclusive process where we get buy-in. I also do individual coaching, like career coaching or leadership coaching for managers. If you want to talk to me online, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'd be happy to talk to you there. Or if you want to have a chat sometime or office hours, I love to talk to people about these topics. And I can't get enough like empathy and validation friends in tech. I'm hoping we can get like a community even somewhere. If you know of any, let me know. All right, I'm ready for questions.
And we're back. So while we wait for a few seconds, if there's any questions, I actually do have a question myself. I found that journaling is helpful, but I don't have a very structured way of doing it. Sometimes it's just jotting some thoughts here and there. Are there any practical techniques that you are familiar with that could help having a more structured approach, or do you think that's okay? It's enough to get better at self-reflection and introspection.
Yeah, I love it. Great question. First of all, it's okay however you do it, whenever you do it. If you're often, I just journal in a Gmail draft because that's the quickest text editor I have available. So I'll just write to myself, and whatever works for you to write is great. But if you want to form a habit, there are a whole bunch of tools. The productivity space has probably too many, honestly. I have some friends who use bullet journaling, and they like that pretty well. That's a technique. You can buy journals at the bookstore that give you prompts, like different questions for each day, and I think that can be interesting too. But it's also okay if you just do it when you're in a stressful situation in a reactive way. You say, okay, now I need to journal about this. That's honestly how I usually approach it. I don't have a regular practice, but a regular practice can be very helpful to get you into the habit of doing it, or even just to constantly reflect.
Thank you. As you might you might go back and take a look at the chat. It was probably one of the most active sessions we had. I think this is a topic that really touches everyone, and in this regard, I have the feeling that it's starting to be spoken more about as a topic, and it is tangential to also mental health, but in my opinion is still not enough. How can we bring more of these ideas, of these feelings out there, especially in our community where it can be solitary sometimes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm always thinking about that too. How can we spread these ideas? How can we spread community connectedness and openness? Whew, I wish I had a good, easy answer. Maybe we would do it already. Any community you're in is a great place to work on this. So like the DC Ruby community, for example, is very tight. We know each other pretty well. And I love that we have Matt's is nice, and so we are nice.
Yes.
That's a great ethos of the Ruby community. But I'm in a lot of communities, and a lot of them are pretty open and inclusive and open to talk about this. So that's a great way to work on it. Another one is at work, and that can be harder to do. You have influence over the culture at work. You do. Everyone does, but not a huge amount. So even there, you need to find your community, the people you can talk to about this, and like strengthen it. I wish we could get more from the top, like top down. We're going to have a good culture here. Like actually, that's hard to do.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I have noticed in my company how much having a manager or in general the leadership being open about their struggles, how much that helps and again validates people's feelings, and how open the rest of the company, your colleagues are then to just accept the fact that we are fallible, and that's okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
This was as great as a talk as I thought it would be. Thank you so much for this. I jumped right into the questions and I didn't got I really didn't use the chance to thank you for bringing this topic up. It was a very well spent hour here with everyone. Any other tips that we can that you could give us to bring more of these practices into our lives?
Yeah, good question. One more time, I want to say, you have to practice these things. I want you to have the references handy. I want you to do it in your life. Set calendar reminders, or maybe share it with a friend for accountability. Whatever will get you to practice these ideas and share them is so powerful. I hope you take this beyond just an interesting talk and you can apply it to your lives, everyone.
We should. We totally should. I'm out of questions for now. I will definitely find you on Twitter.
Awesome.
It's and we'll talk again, I hope, very soon.
Yeah, thank you so
Casey,
much,
it was
Monica.
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.